Hello, and welcome to the Caregivers Journal, the show where we're talking with caregivers about their experiences and their caregiving journey. Welcome, everyone, to the Caregivers Journal's podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today here on Chapter 1. I would like to start with just asking the two of you to do a short introduction for our viewers and listeners about who you are and your experiences, and I'll start with Roberta Carson. Roberta, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. My caregiving started when my 17-year-old son was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, and I cared for him for 27 months until he sadly passed. It was a very overwhelming, stressful situation, and I am using that experience to help other patients and family caregivers better navigate their own injuries and illnesses.
Thank you, Roberta, for being here today. Mr. Bruce McIntyre.
Yeah, my name is Bruce McIntyre. I'm the primary caregiver for my wife. I have been for 20 years. She lives with dermatomyositis, which is a rare disease. Some of our desire out of just struggling through and figuring it out has turned into 5 books that I've written, and she speaks with me on that sometimes. And also along the way, I was volunteering and wound up being the CEO of the Oklahoma Parkinson's Alliance, which is work that I love, serving patients and caregivers. And so glad to be here today.
We're glad to have you. Thank you, Bruce. Well, now I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Denise Brown. And Denise?
Thanks, Lance. Bruce, we're going to start with you. I wonder if you could take us back into time and tell us about what your life was like prior to your wife's diagnosis in 2004.
You know, life was going swimmingly, footloose and fancy free. One thing we say is we were young. We were 31 when she was diagnosed. We're 51 both now. I'm sure she's glad I shared that. And when people asked, do you want to help? Can you do this? Do you want to go there? We always said yes. We said yes to everything. And so that was life prior to diagnosis.
And you had 2 young children.
So yes, we had prior to diagnosis, and as diagnosis happened, a 2-year-old and a newborn.
Okay, so you hear the news, which is not the news you're expecting or prepared to hear. What was the day like when you heard the news?
So the day of diagnosis, we had never had chronic illness before. We always, when we got sick, we took medicine and got well. And so when the doctors at Vanderbilt told us that they did not have a cure for this disease, it was very rare. There was no established protocol at that time. There were only options of what might work. We partially understood that, but not fully. Still on the way home, as we talked about it, we still kind of assumed, but you'll take the medicine and I'm sure it'll work. So we were in somewhat of both of us on the day of diagnosis. We heard it, but we didn't hear it.
Yeah, I think that impact is very difficult to work through. It's surreal. You can't process what the impact is going to be on your life. So you return home. What's the rest of the day like for you?
You know, the rest of the day was horrible. I went back to my office and was just kind of numb for about 30 minutes or so. Just couldn't seem to work. Trying to process, trying to think. My wife was at home with the baby and our 2-year-old, and she was on the phone with, her sister and her mom and just talking about it. When I received a phone call from my mother that my best friend had an attempt on his life. So I got in the car and drove back about an hour to Nashville, where we lived at the time, because my best friend had been struggling with depression, and we knew that, but I had no idea it was that severe. And so on diagnosis day, these 2 horrifying things happened: diagnosis and my best friend attempted to take his life.
You wonder how do we actually make it through a day like that? I'm wondering what helped you take the next step and then the next step?
I don't know. Honestly, I think I was in some degree of shock, and I probably just put everything into objective and analytical mode and just turned off emotions. And for that day, but honestly, the the effects of that day definitely reverberated.
Yeah. We think about diagnosis day. Just hearing the diagnosis is bad enough. And then to hear that a friend is truly struggling is very difficult to actually process.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I called one of our mutual friends who we met at the Vanderbilt Trauma Center. And fortunately for my best friend, he did, he received lots of support. He recovered. He did live 4 more years, and during which we had a lot of good times. But those two things combined were just, they were too much.
It is too much. It's too much to go back to work after hearing about your wife's diagnosis, and yet you went back to work. And I'm curious about that decision. After hearing the news, you bring your wife home and then you say, I'm going to work.
Probably not the best caregiver move ever. But I certainly on that day, I would not have called myself a caregiver. We just, we were 31 years old. We assumed, well, you'll take the medicine and in your case, it'll actually work and you'll get better. So, my wife worked through that rather quickly. She came to terms with reality very quickly. I did not. It took me a few months to come to terms with really what was happening. I kept being hopeful that we would be okay. There was an evening though that really woke me up, and I've told this to you before, Denise. As we went through those early months, and we had a newborn and a 2-year-old, and my wife would coach our 2-year-old through the situation, because what it actually meant for my wife to have dermatomyositis early on is that her muscles were so extremely weak that she couldn't pick up our newborn baby. There were just things she could not do that you just always assume you can do with a toddler and a newborn, and she could not do it. And so one night, as we were finishing up dinner and I was washing some dishes, and our 2-year-old had gone into the living room and was playing with her favorite baby doll, Mandy, we overheard her talking to Mandy, and she was regurgitating to Mandy what she had heard us telling her. She said, Mandy, Mommy loves you very much, but she can't pick you up. You'll need to get up on the couch and crawl in Mommy's lap, and then she can hold you. Which is what we had told my daughter. We had wondered, is she aware of what's going on? Is she processing what's happening in our lives? She was processing it about as well as I was, maybe better. And as we overheard her conversation to her baby doll, I literally just started crying right away. And my wife rushed in to hold her, or to get her to get in her lap so she could hold her. And we knew, yeah, she's clued into what's happening. She's listening. As a 2-year-old, she's processing. She's not immune from our reality.
I've heard that before, and I think every time, just as you express it, it is such a heartbreaking moment. You're trying to move through life as it was, and that's the realization that life is different now. And it's not different for the two of you, it's different for all of you.
Yeah, I always say, we tell Parkinson folks this all the time, people with whatever you're living with, it's not just the patient's problem. It's everybody's problem. Everyone who's in the system, it affects everyone a little bit in some way. And I'm not that much of a crier, but I can never tell that story without crying. It just,
yeah.
So, that's been our life. And it hasn't all been horrible. The first 3 years after diagnosis were very difficult. We're extremely limited. It's why we moved back to Oklahoma City, because my wife grew up in Oklahoma City and all of our support mechanisms on her side of the family were around Oklahoma City. We actually had an agreement to never live in either backyard of either mother, but we had to that's supposed to be funny. Sorry. Not very funny, I guess. Huh? Okay.
I get it.
But we had to break that. We said, you know what? That was an agreement made by young marrieds with no children and who hadn't really encountered chronic illness and significant difficulty yet. But the fact is, when you need help from everybody. And so that's what brought us back to Oklahoma City. And it really was soon after that, unbeknownst to us, there was an expert in my wife's disease. And just to tell you the demographics, there may be 50 people in the whole state of Oklahoma that have her disease. That's not very many. But there was an expert here that she saw, and over the course of a year or two, was able to try some new treatments, and then actually was able to go back to work. And so she is a first grade teacher. Now she's probably 70%, 80% of where she might expect to be physically at her age. She will not work till she's 65 or whatever retirement age might be expected. We're trying to hit 55 maybe. We'll see what happens. It's year to year. But we were fortunate that some things came along. Again, we don't expect her to live to 90, or probably even 80. Expectations have changed. But we have been fortunate that things got better than they initially were in those early few years. So we've been grateful for that.
I'm going to ask you one last question before I turn it over to Lance, who's going to have a conversation with Roberta. Bruce, I wonder, with the perspective of time, if you could have whispered something to Bruce 20 years ago on that diagnosis day, what would you have whispered to him?
Well, there's not just one thing. There's probably about 137 things I would whisper to me. But, if there were two, I would say, number one, acknowledge reality quicker. Because I was the one in denial. And it wasn't helpful. It's a self-defense mechanism, but the further time goes on, the less helpful it becomes. The second would be take care of yourself early and often. It's okay. You have permission. I don't know that I gave myself permission or felt permission for quite a while. And I felt what a lot of caregivers talk about is some guilt or shame, or that maybe I be enjoying when my loved one is struggling and so forth. And I worked through that in probably fairly quick fashion, but it's certainly the first year or so, I did not sense permission to recharge my battery so I could be a better caregiver.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. We're going to connect after Lance interviews Roberta for a discussion about best practices. And I think you've given us some foundation for that conversation. So Lance, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you for sharing that, Bruce. Roberta, we have talked many times about caregivers are not just caregivers for seniors or the older population, that it is a huge demographic out there that take care of children, and like Bruce's case, young newlyweds. And we want to help shine a light on that. And, you've shared your story with me about caring for your son, when he received his diagnosis. But I want to kind of go back in time and talk about that when you and your family first got the diagnosis that, he had this cancer. Walk us through that. What was it like as a mother to be given such a horrific diagnosis and news from the physician?
You can't even describe how devastating something like that is. Zachary was a healthy 17-year-old. We didn't suspect anything. he started having some headaches and just didn't feel that well, but it was June. We figured it was allergies. There was this green pollen everywhere. We took him to the doctor, who said, well, just give him some allergy medication and come back in a week. And in that 1 week, he digressed so much. He was drooling, and 17. And when he drank water, it came out of his nose. So we knew something was seriously wrong. Brought him back to the doctor, who sent us for an MRI. Driving to the MRI, my husband came with us. Zachary was like, what if this is something serious? What if I have a brain tumor? And we're like, oh, I'm sure you don't. It's, maybe a sinus infection, or, something's happening. But if it is a brain tumor, we'll take care of it. We live in Boston, excellent healthcare here. And so we left the MRI office, and my husband went back to work, and I was home with Zachary. We walked in the door. Within 20 minutes, the phone was ringing. The doctor said, come in. So I brought Zachary in. This was well before cell phones, so I couldn't reach my husband. And the doctor separated us, which should have been a clue right then and there, and put Zachary in the exam room and said, let me just talk to your mother for a minute. And he sat me down at a desk in an office and said, is there someone you can call? So I called my husband, but I couldn't reach him. I called my parents who lived nearby, and my mother came, and he didn't tell me anything until my mother came. So I was sitting there panicking. Zachary was in a room by himself, who I'm sure was wondering what was happening. And when my mother arrived, he told us the news that Zachary had a brain tumor. He didn't know that much about it, but that it required immediate attention. I've never had this happen in my life before, but my body went numb. It was a very odd feeling. From my neck down, I just went numb, and it's just absolute panic. I mean, you can't even describe the amount of panic and shock you have in that kind of situation. And the doctor kindly prescribed an Ativan for me. So I called the girlfriend who went to the pharmacy and picked it up. And I eventually reached Paul, my husband, and he came home. And we were still somewhat hopeful that day. That was a Wednesday, because we didn't know exactly what we were facing. Thursday, we went into the local hospitals. We met with a surgeon who said, this isn't operable. I'm not sure why they sent you here. And then we met with an oncologist who became Zach's doctor, who sat us down and told us everything. And we learned that Zachary was terminal, and that without treatment, he would only make it 4 to 6 weeks. And obviously, that's just news that is so hard to take. We were lucky. Zachary went through radiation and chemo and managed to make it 27 months. And I would say 23 of those months were pretty high quality of life. But the last 4 were a nightmare. I know that went beyond the diagnosis, Lance. Sorry about that. But it was an amazingly stressful, shocking couple of days. And Friday morning at 7:30, he started radiation and started chemo that day. So Wednesday, we find out he has a brain tumor. Thursday, we find out what kind. Friday, he takes chemo and radiation.
Well, I'm going to just kind of piggyback on a lot of what you said, Roberta. First and foremost, I have the most admiration and respect for you. As a parent, it's incomprehensible. And I think anybody would agree with that. You can't, or even with a spouse, like in Bruce's situation, those are things you always happens to somebody else, or, it's just something you hear on occasion. As a mom, and you're there, for the most part by yourself, because you, like you said, it's before the real advent of cell phones and quick communication, and you go numb and you go home, and like, I don't even know how you kind of sort through that, because now you have your son who, 17, he's almost an adult. He's got to be dealing with this on some difficult level. I can only imagine, but you're there as his mother, and you have to be strong and supportive of him, but you're still dealing with the news yourself. What were the next 1, 2, 3 days like that night? What were you thinking, just lying in bed, if you could even lie in bed and even fall asleep? Like, how are you? All right, I either, kind of wilt away and try to hide from this, or we're going to face it head on and fight as hard as we can, which I believe that's what you guys did do. How were you processing this? What was the next morning when you woke up? Were you like double checking, like, wait, did that really happen? Did I dream this? Like, what was the next day or two like for you, or maybe even weeks?
Well, a couple of comments on that. First of all, Zachary, being 17, was actually in on all the conversations with the oncologist, which, looking back, was, I think, wrong.
Okay.
Because I think he had a right to know that he had a brain tumor. I don't know if that day he needed to hear how close to death he was. We, of course, would have told him, but it's a lot to hear as a young person. That's a lot. So when we got home, my parents came, Paul, my husband, came, my sisters came, like, just rallied the troops. Although that first night we were still hopeful. We didn't know what kind of tumor it was. We didn't know that it was terminal. But we didn't sleep either. But a couple of interesting little tidbits that give some insight into all of our frame of mind. So Zachary was a 17-year-old boy who loved to give his parents a run for their money. And that night he was in his bedroom and called out to us, and he said, "Sorry for everything I did. I thought I was invincible." I mean, he really took it to heart. He knew he was facing death. And that was really something. Like Bruce, I'm crying. Yeah. And the next morning, just to sort of explain my shock and lack of function, I was making myself a cup of coffee, and we had a single pot coffee cup. You put the water in, you put the coffee in, there's one button. It's either on or off. Like, literally a trained monkey could do that for somebody the monkey was supporting. I could not figure out. I open up, I'm like, where does the water go? Which of these two places is the water? Then I couldn't figure out how to turn it on. It's one button. And that same day, we sit down with the oncologist, who explains the tumor. We didn't understand most of the words coming out of his mouth. I mean, so much medical jargon. And then he tells us there's no known treatment. There are 3 clinical trials that we could potentially get Zach enrolled in, and he describes them to us. We understand none of it. This is the same day where I couldn't figure out where to put the water in the coffee pot. Now I'm trying to decide on chemotherapy for my son who's facing death. So we did what I think everybody in that situation would do. And we asked the doctor, what would you do if it was your kid? And he said, I'd pick A. And we're like, A it is. Like, we can't understand a word you're saying. We're in shock. And we just surrounded ourselves with family. Luckily, my parents live nearby. I have 2 sisters and their husbands who live nearby, and they really came through.
Well, and real quick before we move on, you also have another son also. How, and I don't know the age difference between him and Zach, but how was he coping and managing through all that? Did he feel left out? Was he scared that it was going to happen to him also? I mean, you know how kids are.
Right. So there's 3 years difference. So Zachary was 17 and Jake was 14 at the time. Fortunately for us, Jake was away at sleepover camp when this happened. So he wasn't home and missed a fair amount of the trauma, but we did have to tell him. So we called the camp and we talked to the camp director and discussed it and decided that we'd tell Jake over the phone, and that if he wanted us to drive up, we would try, although Zachary was already, getting radiation. And anyway, we told him. We didn't tell him quite everything. We certainly didn't mention the less than 2% survival, or, just how grim it was, because he was away and didn't see the need. But he did okay for that summer. And also, to all of our benefits, Jake had already enrolled to start boarding school in September in Connecticut, which was a win-win for everybody, because he had already enrolled. So it wasn't like, oh, my brother's sick and my parents sent me away, which could be stressful. And he wasn't here. And it was easier for me because I didn't have to be at the hospital saying, who's getting Jake from school today? Who's picking him up from soccer? I didn't have to worry about the day-to-day requirements of raising him and parenting him. But also he was spared a lot of it, which was great. So it did work out. Actually, this whole process, though, did make the two of them closer.
Yeah. Real quick before we go back to Denise, just a couple of quick questions. What helped you cope through all this? If anything did really truly help, would you be able to put your finger on something?
I think what helped me was the support of my family, but it really didn't help that much.
Sure. And if you were going to title your journal entry for that diagnosis day, what would the title of that entry be?
Worst day of my life.
Okay. And lastly, if Roberta Carson today could go back and talk to Roberta Carson back then, what would you tell her?
It's going to be rough, but you can do it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Roberta. Denise, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, Bruce, I'd also love to know your answer to that question. You're writing in your journal on the day of diagnosis. What's the title of that journal entry?
So when you prompted with that question in the email, I actually went to my box of journals, which I don't know if I should keep or burn, but pretty incriminating. And I dug through back to that time, and I literally did title that day of diagnosis the worst day of my life. So Roberta, I hear you.
It's interesting to hear you tell your stories. It is the worst day of your life, hands down. And yet, when we think about our experience within the healthcare system, there really isn't support for us on the worst day of our life. Let's talk a little bit about best practices that healthcare systems can think about. If you had some kind of support to help you on that day, what would the support look like? Bruce, we can start with you.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because, as you know, we've talked before about everybody's wired a little different. Some folks immediately deal with reality and are quick studies and jump right into it. Others of us have to push it away and process. So I don't know that it's a one size fits all, honestly. And I don't even know if it can. I don't think it can be. So I think my first thing, just in thinking about our own family, and I think we probably did okay on this, is just like, grace for all. I mean, we were just thrust into essentially a grief scenario here, and we're all shocked and angry and guilty, everything else. And so I don't know within the medical care setting if there's, I don't know if this is a scalable solution, but, maybe to have, if there are trained people on hand, that if someone does immediately need to have someone help talk them through, give them a little, just point them in the right direction with some practices, but the thing is, I don't know that everyone could receive that. Could I have received that? I don't know that I would have. My wife might have. I'm not sure I would have on day one. So it's hard to say, but certainly that's, and there are, some of those things are available sometimes, but I think the sheer demand happening within any hospital on any given day, with, between chaplains and other resources, maybe they're there, but they also have significant demand already on them. So I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I think about some kind of list of resources that's given to the family caregiver that says, when you need, and then categories, here are some resources for you to think about that could help.
And I think it's when you're ready, or access these earlier, not later, or, some kind of a prompt, because, in my work here with the Parkinson's organization, we meet people. Sometimes they don't call us until 7 years into the disease. Sometimes it's 7 days. I mean, we see it all. I've had one person call literally from the hospital immediately after diagnosis. That probably was honest. And they came by and we talked with them and gave them ideas. But that was the earliest I've ever seen. Equipped with what to do next.
I think sometimes as family caregivers, we think we need support on our worst day. So we wait for the worst day to happen, and then we're too stressed out. Roberta, your story about trying to actually just give yourself a cup of coffee and how hard that was is the reality of what stress does to us. So this idea that we build our support on our best day, so it's there for our worst day, is helpful to remember because we're too stressed out to figure it out.
True.
Roberta, what would you add to Bruce's insights about best practices?
Well, I agree with Bruce that everybody's different and is ready for different things at different times. And our situation with a child and a terminal diagnosis is pretty hard to take for anybody, or the hardest to take for anybody. I think it would have been great if they had offered a social worker right then and there. We did have access to a social worker. We didn't learn about it until a couple of weeks in, and honestly, he wasn't very good at his job. So it wasn't that helpful for us. But I think, and some people might say, no, I don't think you should force it on people. But perhaps, within a pediatric cancer office or other places where people are getting such devastating news, just say, we've got a social worker. Would you like to speak to him or her? I think it could be very helpful for people. We did receive a binder, like a 3-ring binder of resources. It was literally 4 or 5 inches thick. I brought it home. I never opened it. I put it in the closet. When Zach died, I recycled the pages and threw it away. It was too much. I just couldn't. So, I think getting resources and lists is great, but I think you have to also be careful not to overwhelm people with too much.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, go for it, Bruce.
Along those lines, I was going to say one thing we try to do, and again, everything hits people different, but I do think you can definitely get way too much and it can be overwhelmed, but receiving nothing is not good either. Right. And so one thing we try to do when we do free family consultations with people, whether it's early or late, is there's one form at the end of our conversation that's basically about our suggestions today for, your next right steps. And I think that's it. It's a scalable question as next right steps. On day 1, you're not going to do the same thing you would do on year 2 or year 10, necessarily. But it's just it's all you can fathom is, what do I do next? Or is there one thing or 3 things? Probably not more than 3. And so we kind of do that. And usually it's a very similar answer for most people. And I think within different scenarios of diagnosis and chronic conditions and diseases and so forth, There's usually a pretty similar first steps to take. There's probably 3 out of a possible 5 to 10 that are always recurring. So yeah, boiling it down maybe is a best practice.
Yeah, I think just like one page of here are some resources. They often wonder too about actually scheduling appointments for us. So for instance, Roberta, they didn't offer the social worker. I wondered if, and again, this could be adding work to you, but I wonder if they said, we'd like to schedule an appointment with our social worker for you. We're going to schedule it. Tell us a good day and time for you. Just to take one thing off your to-do list. There's a social worker. Oh no, I have to reach out and schedule it. We're going to do it for you. You don't have to worry about that. Just thinking through some of the items from the to-do list to take off and do it for us right then. And I also think some insights around this is stressful news. This can feel traumatic. During times of stress, this could happen to you. It might be difficult for you to think clearly. It could be helpful to have a note taker from someone in the family who sits and takes notes so you can absorb the news. We did that with my dad when my dad was diagnosed with bladder cancer. I was the note taker. I let my parents absorb the news and then I took notes. And then I was able to explain it to them later because honest to goodness, it was the same. They heard it, but they didn't understand it. They received it, but they didn't comprehend it. It's too much. So if there's not someone who can take notes within the family, maybe there is someone on staff who becomes the note taker. No, I don't know how realistic that is, but it could be helpful to have someone absorb the news for you and then explain it later. Or a recommendation of who you can follow up with because you're going to have more questions. Here's who you can call in 2 days when you have more questions. Just something to help you know that it's not just you guys alone, but there is support out there for you.
Mm-hmm.
I would just jump in to add too, I believe hospice has a great model for what we're talking about, but it doesn't have to necessarily be relegated just for hospice patients where, if somebody enters into hospice, they get an intake, they get an assessment done, but then they're given all of these different resources freely available to them anytime they would like while they're under hospice care. Why can't we do that for families in general when they're not necessarily under hospice, but they receive a horrible diagnosis? Give them all of these resources that are readily available for them to access.
And it could be too that you connect to another family caregiver and another patient in a similar situation. And perhaps there is a volunteer network. So you could actually reach out to someone who has something similar happening who could provide support. Maybe they've a volunteer who's gone through training that can help be an asset and a resource.
That would be great.
I think we'll close with just a quick conversation about what do we do for ourselves on diagnosis day? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think there just has to be grace for all and just assume the best for everyone because it's everyone's worst day. And the people that get angry are going to get angry. And the ones that get sad are going to get sad. And, you're going to be all over the place. And, so if someone's listening to this, just, grace for all.
I agree.
Yeah.
But also I would say in receiving, most of us tend to be helpers, not helpies. And I think you receive the help and people's best intentions, but try to hear the best intentions because some folks say things and offer things and you're like, what in the world are they talking about? Or that's even offensive. But I always try to remind myself, just receive the best intention from people. And connect with the best resources you have. If you're a get out and walk person, get out and walk. If you need to exercise. If you need to meditate or pray, get to it. Create space for everyone. Connect with friends. I think the people that connect earliest process earliest. And so, but we're not all prone to do that necessarily, but it is true. The quicker we get to the resources, the quicker we process.
Lance, what kind of final thoughts would you offer?
I would just say, we've kind of touched on different variations of this, but, find people who may be going through what you're going through. So, like for Bruce's situation, your social circle probably didn't consist of other husbands and wives going through something that you and your wife were going through. So they could be there in a supportive way, but they can't really understand what you're going through and what you're going to be experiencing. And, the same with Roberta. We don't all know somebody who has a child that has a terminal diagnosis. So connecting with like-minded people and like-minded situations, I think only serves to benefit them and you, so that you do feel like your friends are going to hear you, but they may not understand you. So, finding those people can just add that extra level of support. So you can go in a closet, call them and just, cry or vent, and they'll get it, where your other friends, they may be that ear for you to, kind of lean on, or that shoulder to lean on, but they might not truly have a deep understanding of what you're experiencing, which may not be the most helpful, thing for you during those times.
Bruce and Roberta, thank you both so much for joining us today. It was a great discussion. We so appreciate spending time with us and sharing so honestly about the worst day of your life.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
Denise, thank you for the opportunity to
Our
share.
pleasure. Thank you for sharing. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us here today at the Caregivers Journal, the show where we're talking with caregivers about their experiences and their caregiving journey. We look forward to seeing you again next month.